Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. In this video we'll take a look at the rarest instrument approach in the world, the SDF approach. We'll talk about what it is and how to fly it, and then demonstrate flying the only one left in the United States in the G1000 equipped Cessna 172. As always, if you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video, share with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell to be alerted to new content. Before watching this video, you should be familiar with the basics of instrument flying as well as the basics of flying instrument approaches. It's also a good idea to be familiar with the basics of flying localizer approaches, as the SDF approach is very similar to a localizer approach, and it's a good idea to be familiar with how to descend on an instrument approach that does not have vertical guidance. It's also a good idea to be familiar with the operation of the Garmin G1000. We won't be using the GPS functions of the unit to fly this approach, but we will be using many of its other features. I'll leave links to all of those videos, plus a link to the entire instrument training playlist in this video's description. So what is an SDF approach? SDF stands for Simplified Directional Facility. An SDF is a nav aid that's very similar to a localizer. It transmits a single course for lateral guidance on an instrument approach. Just like a localizer, all you need to receive it is a VOR radio, and the course information can be displayed on an HSI or a traditional VOR course indicator. So what's the difference between a localizer and an SDF? The primary difference is that an SDF course is a little wider and thus a little less precise than a traditional localizer. Localizer courses are set to a width of between 3 and 6 degrees, depending on the runway length. The course width is calibrated so that it's 700 feet wide side to side, or 350 wide from the center of the course to full-scale deflection at the approach threshold of the runway it serves. The longer the runway is, the narrower the course needs to be, with the course width for runways 10,000 feet and longer being around 3 degrees, and the course width for runways 5,000 feet and shorter being about 6 degrees. An SDF approach's course width is fixed at either 6 or 12 degrees wide, regardless of how long the runway is. If the data from Little Nav Map is accurate, the course width on the only SDF approach left in America, which is in Morristown, Tennessee, is 6 degrees, which makes it about the width that a localizer would be to a runway of that size. But when there were 12-degree wide SDFs out there, the sensitivity or precision of the course was about half that of a normal localizer, though it still makes it about double the sensitivity or precision of a VOR course. The only other big difference between a localizer and an SDF is that a localizer may be paired with a glide slope to create an ILS approach, whereas an SDF approach will never have a glide slope. SDF transmitters have a 3-letter identifier like a VOR or an NDB instead of having a 4-letter identifier starting with the letter I like localizer transmitters have. They're depicted on IFR charts with a course feather symbol like is used for a localizer, LDA, or back course, but with the SDF symbol there's no shading like there is for a localizer. It's just an empty course feather symbol. SDF transmitters are the same as localizer transmitters in most other regards. They operate on the same frequencies, 108 to 112 megahertz on the odd tenths frequencies. They have about the same range of 18 nautical miles if you're within 35 degrees of the course, and they can be equipped with DME, which the one left in the world is at Morristown, Tennessee, is still equipped with DME. According to the Airman's Information Manual, an SDF can also be offset from the runway like a localizer, which would turn the localizer into an LDA, but in practice the only SDF that exists right now is pointed straight down the runway that it serves, and even when they were less rare than they are today, I've never seen one that was offset. SDFs also transmit both a front and back course like localizers do, and that function is emulated in Flight Simulator. I've never seen an instrument approach based on an SDF back course, but you could still use it to align with the one runway that it serves if you would like to do it in VFR conditions. Like a localizer, the approach course will be set for you automatically in Flight Sim if you're using an electronic HSI like the one in the Garmin G1000. If you're using a mechanical HSI, you'll need to set the course manually to get a correct sight picture. If you're using an old-fashioned VOR display, it's good practice to set the OBS to the approach course as a reminder, but it really doesn't matter what you do with the OBS. It will always display the correct course no matter what you do with the knob. An SDF approach is flown pretty much exactly like a localizer approach without a glide slope. You track the SDF course to the final approach fix, which is an NDB for this approach. Then after you cross the final approach fix, you descend to your MDA or DDA while continuing to use the SDF course to stay aligned with the runway until you either get the runway in sight or you hit your missed approach point or DDA and execute your missed approach procedure. The one SDF approach that's left in the US is equipped with DME, so we can use a continuous descent final approach rather than a dive and drive descent, which we'll talk about when we brief the approach. SDF approaches have always been fairly rare. Even 20 or 30 years ago, there were only a handful of them. But since they fly pretty much exactly like a localizer approach without a glide slope, any pilot who is proficient at those should find an SDF pretty easy to fly. And Microsoft Flight Simulator gives us a chance to go out and experience flying this rare approach for ourselves. So let's demonstrate flying an SDF approach by taking a short IFR flight between McGee-Tyson Airport in Knoxville, Tennessee. The identifier on that airport is Kilo Tango Yankee Sierra, to Moore Murrell Airport in Morristown, Tennessee, which the identifier on that airport is Kilo Mike Oscar Romeo. It is home to the last SDF approach in the United States, the SDF to runway 5. After we depart Knoxville, we'll plan to fly direct to Volunteer VORTAC, which serves as an initial approach fix for the approach. We'll then track the Volunteer 069 degree radial until we intercept the SDF course at Layab's intersection, 14.2 miles from the VORTAC. We'll then intercept and track the SDF course the rest of the way in for the approach. Our filed route will be Knoxville Airport, direct to Volunteer VORTAC, direct to Morristown Airport. I'd probably also put a note in the remarks of the flight plan that I'm planning to fly the SDF approach at Morristown from Volunteer VORTAC. We'll file for an altitude of 5,000 feet, which keeps us above the initial approach segment altitude from Volunteer. The flight is about 38 track miles long and should take us about 25 minutes to fly in the Cessna 172. We'll plan to depart runway 5 right at Knoxville. There is a SID for Knoxville, the Knoxville 7 departure that we'll expect to fly. If we look at the route description for that, it tells us that the procedure is to climb on heading of 051, which is runway heading, or is assigned by the tower for vectors to our filed route, and then maintain 6,000 or a lower assigned altitude, which our assigned altitude will be 5,000, and expect clearance to the requested altitude in 10 minutes after departure, which again, we're going to file and fly 5,000, which we know is safe for that initial approach segment, and it's also safe to get us from Knoxville Airport to Knoxville VOR, which is only about 7 miles or so. We also note that at the bottom of the plate here, it says that the takeoff minimums for all runways at Knoxville are standard. We'll assume that the weather in Knoxville is good enough that we can get back in on one of the ILSs there and that we feel comfortable departing. The current weather report at Morristown shows calm winds, 1 statute mile visibility in mist, ceiling overcast 700 feet, temperature 22, dew point 22, and altimeter 2992, with a forecast for the weather to remain unchanged for the next few hours. We'll assume that we have filed an alternate for the flight and that it is a legal alternate. All right, so let's take a good look at this approach plate and make sure that we understand everything we need to understand about the approach before we talk about the techniques we'll use specifically to fly it in the 172. Looking at the top left corner, it is Morristown, Tennessee is the town, and then looking at the top right corner, it's the SDF to runway 5 for Moore Murrell Airport. Identifier is Mike Oscar Romeo, or Kilo Mike Oscar Romeo if you wanted to put it in your GPS. It tells us that the primary nav aid for this approach is an SDF with DME. The identifier is MOR, and the frequency is 109.5. It gives us channel information, which we can't do anything with as civilian users, but that tells us that this does have DME, which it already told us up here. And then it reiterates all that information down here. It bolds the box here to tell us that this is the primary nav aid. It is an SDF. There's the identifier. There's the identifier in Morse code if we want to listen to that. It gives us the frequency, and again gives us a channel which tells us it has DME. It tells us that the final approach course is 053, and again that's reiterated here on the plan view. Then it gives us some runway information. It tells us that the runway landing length is 5717. It tells us that the touchdown zone is 1313 and the airport elevation is also 1313. In the notes box here, we have a T, which tells us that this airport has non-standard takeoff minimums, an obstacle departure procedure, or obstacle departure notes. None of those are applicable to us as an IFR arrival, but if we depart out of here IFR, we'll need to go take a look at those. And then it says the A is NA, which means that this approach is not available for use to file this airport as an alternate. So to see if we could file this airport as an alternate, we would need to look at the other approach procedures. It does tell us that an ADF is required, and the reason for that is twofold. First of all, we have to use the NDB to identify the final approach fix. Even though this station has DME, it does not give us a DME distance to identify the final approach fix, so we have to put that bearing pointer up for the NDB, and once that bearing pointer swings from the nose to the tail, we know we've passed the NDB, and we can start down towards our MDA. We also need it for the missed approach hold, because the missed approach hold is there at the NDB as well. It also gives us a lot of notes about if our local altimeter setting is not received, we use Tyson Airport's altimeter setting and increase the minimums. We also do some things if the approach lining is inoperative and we don't have the local altimeter setting. None of that is applicable to us. We are going to assume that we have the local altimeter setting, and we know that the approach lining is operative. Speaking of approach lighting, it tells us over here that we have a medium intensity approach lighting system with sequence flashing lights. So that's the type of approach lighting system that we have. Then it tells us that the missed approach procedure is climb straight ahead to 2000, then make a climbing right turn to 3200 while making that right turn to the NDB, and will hold at the NDB. It gives us the communications frequencies in the order that we're going to use them. First, we'll pick up the weather on the AWAS frequency. Then we will be talking to Knoxville Approach. And then our Unicom frequency is 122.8. That is where we call to get fuel and things like that. That's not something that's emulated in Flight Simulator, but it does double as the Common Traffic Advisory frequency. So Knoxville Approach will hand us off to this to make our traffic calls once we're probably a mile or two outside the final approach fix. Also tells us that the runway lighting is pilot controlled in the real world, but that again is not emulated in Flight Simulator. Looking at the plan view, we do have a couple of bodies of water that are depicted here. It also reiterates that the ADF is required. We have numerous obstacles on the plate that tell us, give us the symbol, and then tell us what our altimeter would read if we were to hit the top of that obstacle. And then the tallest obstacle is has the largest symbol and the largest lettering there, so we know that's the highest obstacle, well north of the approach course and all of our feeder routes that we're going to use. We do have a couple of different feeder routes. One comes in from Tempe intersection. I assume that's on an airway up here, and it gives you the procedure altitude and the course and the distance on that. Same thing for coming down here from winds. You'll also notice that we have a little dot here. This indicates that this is terrain. So we do have some high terrain in the area, fairly close to the airport, about, 400 feet above the airport, just to the south of the airport here. So that's something to be aware of as well. It gives us the MSA for this area, the minimum safe altitude. Again, this is not a procedure altitude, but tells you if you had an emergency and needed to go down, If you're within this distance and this direction of, in this case, the NDB, if you're north of the NDB, you can go down to 4,300 feet, and you'll notice it's quite high to the south. This is due to mountainous terrain down in this area. It's 7,900 feet. You'll notice that where we're coming in from, here is the line right here that divides the two MSA sectors. So we're actually in the 7,900 foot sector when we're coming in for volunteer VOR or VORTAC, but we have our own procedure altitude on this initial approach segment that keeps us safe, so we don't need to worry about that. So we do have this information for the MSA, but it's not really applicable to us since we will be on a segment of the approach that has a published procedure altitude. Looking at our route in here, so it says that volunteer VORTAC does serve as an initial approach fix and gives us all the information for the VOR. And so we can see that this segment altitude right here, this initial approach segment, it does have a procedure altitude of 3,600 feet. It tells us that we do not need to do this procedure turn here if we're coming in from this segment versus if we were coming in from any of these other segments, we would need to do the procedure turn. It gives us the course, and then it tells us it's 14.2 nautical miles from the VORTAC to Layab's intersection. It identifies Layab's intersection as the intersection of the 069 degree radial and the SDF course. You could also identify it as being 14.2 DME from volunteer VOR. So those are the two different ways you could identify it. It does serve as an initial or an intermediate fix on this approach. So we could navigate directly there using a GPS if we didn't want to use the volunteer VOR. And then it also tells us the procedure is not available on this initial approach segment here if we're coming in to volunteer on the 022 or the 102 degree radials. So we wouldn't be able to use it there. It also tells us the Jefferson NDB is also initial approach fix, but we would need to do the procedure turn if we were to start the approach at Jefferson. And it does give us all the information for Jefferson VOR. I believe that's pretty much all the information on the approach plate. Again, we have the SDF information up here. So we've got all of that. Let's take a look at the plan view. Oh, I will mention that it does have a procedure turn on this approach. If we are approaching from Tempe or Winds or start the approach at Jefferson, then we would want to fly out this way either a minute or 2 minutes and then turn right to a heading of 188. Excuse me, left turn to a heading of 188 and then back around to a heading of 008 to re-intercept the SDF course. But the way we are coming in for the approach, again, it says no PT, so we don't need to do that coming in from the direction that we're going to come in. Looking at the plan view here, it tells us remain within 10 nautical miles. This tells us if we are doing the procedure turn, that to be able to use this as a valid altitude, we need to stay within 10 miles of the NDB. Since we're not doing the procedure turn and we have procedure altitudes published on the segments we're going to be flying, that's not really applicable to us. We maintain 3,200 feet until we get to the NDB, and then we can descend down to our MDA, or in our case, our DDA, and then fly forward until we hit the missed approach point, which is 1.2 DME from the SDF transmitter, and it is, you can see, located at the runway threshold. It tells us that the visual descent angle is 2.95 degrees, so pretty close to a normal 3-degree slope, and that's what we're going to be targeting to fly as we do our continuous descent final approach method on this approach, and we'll talk more about that here in just a second. And then if we stay on this 2.95 degree visual descent path, then we will cross the threshold. Our threshold crossing height will be 39 feet above the runway threshold. It also tells us that the distance between the final approach fix, the NDB, and the runway threshold is 5.9 nautical miles. Looking at our minimums, we are a Category A aircraft, so that is the box we want to use. We are doing the straight-in approach to runway 5. So that's the box we want to use. It tells us that our MDA is 1860, and then it tells us visibility required to fly this approach or land from this approach is 3/4 of a mile. And then it tells us that the height above touchdown of that MDA, or how high we'll be above the runway touchdown zone elevation at this altitude on our altimeter, will be 547 feet above the runway. And then, of course, the parentheses box is for military use. We do not use that. We will be adding 50 feet to that to get a DDA, which will serve as a decision height. So we will use that as our point at which we go missed approach if we don't have anything in sight. And of course, we don't want to use the category C or D boxes, and we're not going to use circling minimums, so we can ignore that as well. Looking at the airport diagram, top left reiterates our touchdown zone, or excuse me, our airport elevation, which is 1313, and our touchdown zone elevation, which is the same. It gives us an airport diagram with the runways and the taxiways. It shows us where the rotating beacon is located. Shows us that we have a PAPI on 23 and a VASI on runway 5. It tells us the length and width of the runway. It tells us the 23 has a 0.7 degree upslope. That will be a downslope for us on the back half of the runway there. It tells us that the approach lighting type it has and gives us a picture of that, and then shows us the approach course comes in pretty much straight in on this approach. It tells us that we have runway in identifier lights on 5 and 23, so we have a strobe light on either side of the runway that will also help us identify the runway once we break out, and that we have medium intensity runway lighting on runway 5 and 23. Down here, it gives us the distance from the final approach fix, which is the NDB, to the missed approach point at the threshold of the runway, and reiterates that as 5.9 nautical miles. And then it does give us the time it would take to fly from those 2 points at various different ground speeds. So if we did not have DME, we could actually time this, start the time at the NDB, and then once we got to the time down here at the various different airspeeds, we would need to execute the missed approach, because that's when we would arrive at the missed approach point. But we don't need to worry about that, because we do have DME, and so we know exactly where that missed approach point is. All right, so let's talk about specifically how we're going to fly this approach coming in from the direction we're coming in the 172. So we're taking off out of Knoxville VOR, climbing to 5,000 and going direct to the Knoxville VOR. Once we cross the Knoxville VOR, we will track the 069 degree radial outbound. Once we get about 4 nautical miles from 4 to 5 nautical miles from Volunteer, we'll assume that we get handed off to this sector of Knoxville approach, and that we get clearance for the approach. We do have a procedure altitude on this initial approach segment that we could descend to once we're established on it and cleared for the approach. I'm going to stay at 5,000 feet, though, until we get to Layab's intersection, and then I'll just start the descent down. We've got 10 miles between Layab's and the final approach fix, which is plenty of room to get from 5,000 to 3,200 feet. So I will wait until there to go ahead and start that descent. So we're tracking the 069 degree radial outbound. What I'll probably do is I'll have Knoxville in VOR number 1 in the main HSI to track to it, and to track the 069 degree radial outbound initially. And then once we get 4 or 5 miles from the VOR, what I'll probably do is put Knoxville into VOR number 2 and track it using the bearing pointer to make sure that we're staying on that 069 degree radial. And I will put the SDF there at Morristown into number 1 so that I can monitor the intercept of that course. Again, I could descend down to 3,600 feet once I get clearance for the approach, but I probably won't do that. And I know I've gotten to Layab's when I'm on the 069 degree radial, and I have intercepted the SDF course, or once I'm on the 069 degree radial and I am at 14.2 DME away. So once I get to Layab's, I'll go ahead and descend down to 3,200 feet at my cruise altitude. And at that time, it's probably time to go ahead and configure for the approach. So once I'm level at 3,200 feet, and once I'm about 3 miles from the NDB, which will be about 9 DME from the SDF transmitter, we'll go ahead and configure. So I will bring my power to 1,800 RPM. I will hold the pitch so that the aircraft slows, and so that we stay at 3,200 feet. When we get to 110 knots, which should be pretty much immediately, we'll bring the flaps to 10 degrees. And then when we get to 85 knots, we'll go ahead and bring the flaps incrementally, one notch at a time, down to 30 degrees. When we get to 70 knots, actually probably about 5 knots before, we want to increase the power to maintain level flight at 3,200 feet. At 70 knots, that should be 2,200 to 2,400 RPM. Once we're level at 3,200 at 70 knots in our landing configuration, we can go ahead and accomplish the before landing checklist, and you can do what you would like with the autopilot and the flight director. I will be flying this approach with the autopilot and the flight director, but if you wanted to do it without the autopilot or the flight director, you could go ahead and turn those off at this time. Once we get to the NDB, which we'll know when the bearing pointer for the NDB flips from the nose to the tail, then we can go ahead and start our descent. We will be doing a CDFA, or a continuous descent final approach method. So we will want to initiate a 400 foot per minute descent. We'll want to reduce our power to 1,800 to 2,000 RPMs to maintain that 70 knots in the descent. We will cross-check our altitude with our descent cross-check points, which we will talk about how we're going to do that here in just a second. And then we adjust the descent rate as needed. We'll track the SDF with small changes in heading, just like we would track a localizer or a VOR. And then we'll transition to a visual landing once the required visual cues are in sight, or if we don't get the visual cues in sight by the time we reach our DDA, we will go missed approach, or we can execute the missed approach anytime prior to that if we feel the approach has become unsafe or unstabilized. So again, on this approach, we're going to perform a continuous descent final approach technique, which is where we try to track a calculated glide path rather than descending rapidly down to our MDA and then flying forward to the missed approach point. To do that, there are a few extra steps that we need to take before we start the approach. First, we need to calculate a derived decision altitude. This will serve just like a decision altitude on a precision approach. And then once we reach the DDA, if we don't have anything in sight, we will go ahead and execute the missed approach. We also need to calculate a descent rate to track the visual descent angle, and the visual descent angle, or VDA, is that angle we saw on the profile view of the approach plate. We need to calculate descent cross-check points so that we can track the visual descent angle and tell if we are high or low and make adjustments. So let's go ahead and look at how to do that. So calculating our derived decision altitude, or DDA, is very simple. All we need to do is add 50 feet to our published MDA. The MDA for this approach for our category aircraft for the straight-in approach is 1860, so add 50 feet to that, and our DDA is going to be 1,910 feet. And this works the same as a decision altitude on an ILS approach or an RNAV LPV type approach. We get down to this altitude, and if we don't see anything, it's time to execute the missed approach. The next thing we need to do is calculate the descent rate we need to track the visual descent angle. And again, that visual descent angle is published on the profile view of the plate. For this approach, it's 2.95 degrees. So what we want to do is come over to our climb and descent table, and we want to see what rate of descent is needed for our vertical angle. Unfortunately, we have 2.9 degrees and we have 3 degrees, but we don't have 2.95 degrees, and we have 60 knots and we have 90 knots. That tells us our descent rates down here, but we don't have 75 knots, which is about what we're going to be flying. So what we'll have to do is average all these four numbers together to get a 2.95 degree path at about 75 knots, and when we do that, we come up with a descent rate of 392 feet per minute. So when we hit the NDB, we'll start our descent rate down, and again, 392, pretty close to 400. We'll use 400 initially, and that's the descent rate we'll use, and then we'll calculate our descent cross-check points so that we can check that descent as we're coming down to tell if we're too high or too low. So to calculate the descent cross-check points, first we need to know our threshold crossing height, which we know is on the plan view or the profile view here, We're 3,900 feet above the threshold if we stay on this visual descent angle as we cross the threshold. And we need to know our touchdown zone elevation, or how high that end of that runway is on our altimeter if we were sitting on the ground on the end of that runway. So if we add 39 feet to 1313 feet, that means our altimeter should read 1352 as we cross that threshold on that visual descent angle. Then we go over to this column of the climb and descent table, and it tells us for various vertical path angles, how many feet above that threshold crossing altitude will you be for every mile you are away from the runway. Again, we have 2.9 and a 3.0 degree path, so we'll have to average this out. And if we do that, we know that for every nautical mile we move away from the runway, we'll be 313 feet higher above that threshold crossing altitude as we move back further away from that runway. Again, we know that the threshold is located at 1.2 DME, and again, we should have 1,352 feet on our altimeter as we cross that threshold. So if we move a mile away from the threshold, which will be 2.2 DME, we'll be 313 feet higher. That's going to be 1665 on our altimeter. At 2 miles from the threshold, which is 3.2 DME, again, another 313 feet higher from that 1665, so now 1978. And then 3 nautical miles is 4.2 DME, that'll be 2291. And then 4 nautical miles is 5.2 DME, that's 2604. And then 5 nautical miles is 6.2 DME, and that should be about 2917. And what I'll do is I'll write these down or take a screenshot of this to have with me as I fly the approach. And then as I cross the NDB and I get to 6.2 DME, I'm going to take a look at my altimeter and see where I am. I should be about 2,900 feet. If I'm at 3,000 feet, I'm a little high. I need to increase my rate of descent. If I'm at 2,800 feet, I'm a little low. I need to decrease my rate of descent. And then we will cross-check at every mileage point that is shown here until we get to 3.2, and then we're about our derived decision altitude, make adjustments, and then we'll get to our decision altitude or our derived decision altitude 1910, and hopefully pick up the runway at that point. All right, so let's set up for the flight from the world map. We will start the top left, work our way to the right, and then down, just like we usually do. So we will first take a look at the aircraft. Aircraft selection, we want the Textron Aviation Cessna 172 Skyhawk G1000. You will not see Arista Blue unless you have this particular third-party livery installed that I have. Liveries, you can do whatever you'd like to do with that. Weight and balance, we will set it to 100% fuel, which is 2 full wing tanks, and then we can stick with the 2 170-pound occupants in the pilot and the co-pilot seat. You don't need to do anything with failures, and then customization, you can do whatever you would like to do with that. We will select the from airport. We want to select Knoxville Tyson Airport. The identifier there is Kilo Tango Yankee Sierra McGee Tyson Knoxville. So we will select that. And then you can select either runway 5 right if you'd like to start on the runway, or over here is the general aviation facility, I believe. So you can select to start at parking. I'm going to go ahead and do that and set that as our departure point. And then let's see here, flight conditions we are going to set as far as date, middle of June for lighting conditions, and then we'll set the time. Down here in the bottom left, we'll set it to noon, and again, that's for lighting conditions. And then we'll set the weather in the session itself, and that should have us set up and ready to go. So we'll click fly, get in, and set up the weather. So once we're in the session, we'll go ahead and set up our weather. Again, we've got it set to noon here. We can double check that time. We do want the altitude calculation to set to AMSL, and then we'll go down here to, we'll leave the first 2 cloud layers alone and go to the 3rd cloud layer. We will set the coverage to overcast 100%. We will set the density to 0.5. That should give us about a mile visibility, maybe just a little bit more. Scatter, it really doesn't matter what you do with that if you're set to overcast coverage, but I do leave that at 0. I've got the top set to around 10,000 feet, so we won't break out at 5,000 feet. And then the bottoms I have set at 1,000 feet. And the way I get this is I take my DDA of 1,910 feet, subtract 1,000 feet, that gives me 910, and then I round up to the next 1,000. That should have us breaking out within 100 feet or so of our minimums. As far as the rest of the settings, precipitation, I do not put anything in there that will reduce your visibility slightly, so I don't recommend putting anything in there. Snow depth, obviously not realistic at the temperatures we have. Lightning, I don't have anything set. I've got that set to 0. Temperature, I've got sea level temperature set to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which will prevent icing below about 8,000 feet or so. Pressure I have set standard at 2992, and the humidity I have set at its lowest setting of 1. And again, if you elevate the humidity, that will affect your visibility, so I do recommend keeping it there. All right, so let's get the aircraft started up, and then we will go ahead and get the avionics set up. All right, so now that we have the aircraft started up and the avionics booted up, let's go ahead and set up the G1000 for this flight. The first thing I'm going to do is put volunteer VOR into our primary for radio number 1. That's going to be 16.4. So we'll dial that in and then swap that into the active. And you can see we're already getting a good identifier. We are already receiving it. I am going to go ahead and center up the needles so I know what direction we need to fly to get to that. So that is set up. I'm going to go ahead and set up the SDF in the standby for that radio. So that frequency is 1095, so I'm ready to go there. I'll push the middle of this small knob here to move it down to radio number 2. And I'm going to put volunteer VOR down here in the active for radio 2 as well. That way I can flip over to that one once I'm ready to monitor the SDF intercept on radio number 1, and you can see I'm already receiving that as well. Let's see here. Other things I want to do here, I'm going to go to CDI. I do want on VR1, and I will keep it there for the entire flight. Other PFD options, I do have the wind set up like I want. I will set DME in here so that I have a good DME indication. I'm going to set bearing 1 pointer to my ADF so that I have an ADF a pointer up there to know when I have crossed the NDB for the final approach fix on the approach. Bearing 2, I'm going to set up to nav number 2 so that I have a reference for when I flip nav number 1 over to the SDF course. I have a course reference there. I believe that's everything I need to do here on the PFD options. Other things I need to do, I need to set up my ADF. So I'm going to set that to, let's see here, the frequency for Jefferson VOR is 346. So I will get that dialed in here and get that tuned into the active 346. There we go. Hit enter to swap it out, and that's active now. So that's good. DME mode, I'm fine with nav1. I can get DME also off my bearing pointer. So I have both of the DMEs there. Let's see here. We'll go over to timer reference. And I will set up, I'm going to set my glide speed to 70, which is my approach speed. So I have a reference for the approach speed, and then I will turn the minimums to on, to barrow rather, and then I will set that up for my DDA of 1910. All right, so that's set up to 1910. So all of that is set up, and then the last thing I need to do is set up my autopilot. So I went ahead and dialed the altitude pre-select to 5,000 feet. I'm going to set my heading bug to the runway heading for runway 5 right at McGee Tyson, which is 051. So I will get that rolled in there. All right, so all of that is set up. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my multifunction display to the traffic map just to get rid of the moving map so that I do all this on raw data. and get the practice flying the approach in raw data and not cheating using a moving map. So all of that is set up, and now I will go ahead and get my comm radios set up, and I will call Knoxville clearance to get our IFR clearance out to Morristown. So Knoxville does have a clearance delivery frequency that we can use on 12165. So we'll call them up and say Cessna 172 Golf Hotel is on the GA ramp with the current ATIS information looking for our IFR clearance to Morristown. And I would probably tell them we're planning to fly the SDF approach out there, and we're planning to fly the approach from the initial approach fix of Knoxville or volunteer VOR. They call back and they say, Cessna 172 Golf Hotel, you're cleared to Morristown Airport via the Knoxville 7 departure, then is filed. Climb via the SID, except maintain 5,000. Departure frequency is 123.9, squawk 5502. We read all of that back and get all of that set up as far as our transponder code and that sort of stuff, and then we'll give them a call when we are ready for taxi. After getting our clearance, we'll get taxi clearance from ground control, taxi out, do our run up, and call tower once we're holding short of runway 5 right. We'll assume they call back and say Cessna 172 Golf Hotel, fly runway heading, runway 5 right, cleared for takeoff. We'll accomplish our before takeoff checklist and perform a normal takeoff from runway 5 right. And as we're climbing out, the tower hands us off to departure control, and we call up. We say Cessna 172 Golf Hotel is with you, 2,300 climbing 5,000. They call back. They say Cessna 172 Golf Hotel, roger, radar contact, climb maintain 5,000, proceed direct to volunteer VORTAC, and then track the 069 degree radial outbound. We read all of that back, and I've got it in heading mode, flight level change mode with the autopilot on. So I'm going to go ahead and center up my course direct to the volunteer VOR, and then I will go ahead and swing the heading over there, and it's good and centered up. So I'll go ahead and engage the nav mode. So we'll go ahead and climb up to 5,000 feet, cruise out the airplane, and then once we cross the volunteer VORTAC, we'll go and track that 069 degree radial outbound to get set up for the approach. All right, so we're climbing up through 4,300 feet on our way to 5,000 feet. We're within a mile of the VOR, so we're keeping an eye on the to from flag, and that should flip to a from here pretty soon. If we're 4,000 feet above the VOR, our slant range error is going to be close to a mile. So we'll keep a close eye on that. When that happens, we'll put it into heading mode, turn out to that 069 degree heading, set the course up for 069, and then work to intercept that radial and join that initial fix. There is the drop off on the flag. I'm going to go ahead and put it into heading mode. I'm going to go ahead and turn over to that 069. There's the flip to the from side there. There's 069 on the heading. Now I'll put 069 in there on the course. It looks like we're a little bit off to the left right now, so I'll put about a 10 degree correction in there. I've got to also watch my altitude. It's going to go into altitude capture here in just a second. And so we'll intercept and track this outbound radial. There comes the needle swinging in. There's the altitude capture. So I'll let it accelerate to about 105 and then pull the power back to 2,500, 2,450, something like that. You notice that needle is moving pretty quickly. So I'll put it back over here on just a little bit of an intercept, and then I'll go ahead and engage that nav mode once it's good and centered up there. Looks like I need just a little bit of a right turn to get it all centered up there. And there comes 101. Everything happens all at once. So there is about 105, so I'll pull the power back to 2,500 or so. Looks like we're good and centered up, so I'll go ahead and engage the nav tracking. It's gone into VOR tracking mode. So now all I have to do is track it out for 14.2 nautical miles. I'll probably ride this out to about 10 miles or 9 miles away from the VOR. before I flip over to the SDF and number 1 and just look at the bearing pointer to make sure I stay on course with the VOR radial. So that's what we'll do. We'll track it outbound to 14.2 nautical miles. We'll intercept the SDF course, and then we'll start descending for the approach. And as we hit 4.2 nautical miles, we're about 10 miles away from Labas, or Layab's intersection. So at that point, Knoxville Approach will probably hand us off to the next sector, 132.8. So they call up and say, contact Knoxville 132.8. We go ahead and flip over to 132.8 and contact them. Say Cessna 172 Golf Hotel is with you, level at 5,000. They say Cessna 172 Golf Hotel, you are about 9 miles from Layab's intersection. Maintain 5,000 until established on the approach. Cleared for the SDF runway 5 approach at Morristown. We read all of that back. We're now authorized to go down to the procedure altitude on this radial outbound from Volunteer, but we'll probably tell them we're just going to stay at 5,000 until we get to Layab's intersection, and they say that's approved as requested. So we are cleared for the approach. We can use the procedure altitudes now, and so we will track this out to about 9.2 DME, and then we'll flip over on the number 1 nav to where we have the SDF in there, and we'll keep an eye on our radial to make sure we're on course using the bearing pointer for number 2. And then once we intercept the SDF course, then we'll go ahead and descend down to 3,200 feet for that intermediate segment and get ready to configure for the approach. All right, so there's 9.2, 9.3 miles from the Volunteer VORTAC. That means we're about 5 miles away from Layab's. Take a look and make sure my heading indicator is good and centered up here. It looks like it is, so I'm going to go ahead and put it in heading mode so it doesn't wander off when I change radios. I'm going to go ahead and flip the SDF transmitter into the number 1 nav. We're showing Loc 1. You notice it automatically dialed my frequency up here for me. And you can see that needle's already starting to move off of the wall there. So once that centers up, we know we're at Layab's. We'll probably double check it and see if we're about 14.2 miles from Volunteer. That will double check it for us. And once we're centered up on the course, what I'm going to do is let it center up, use the heading to turn on to the course, and then I will activate the nav mode again. If I activated nav right now, it would probably go to the right and start chasing it a little bit. That's still a little bit of a flaw in the system where it tries to chase courses if they are alive. So I'll wait until it gets good and centered up. I do have a good altitude hold here. I know that my next altitude on the approach is going to be 3,200 feet. So we'll go ahead and dial that into my altitude pre-selector here. So I've got 3,200 feet, and I'm ready to descend on that intermediate segment once I get to Layab's. So everything is set up now for that intermediate segment, and I'm just waiting to intercept the SDF course. All right, so I'm going to wait for that needle to get good and centered up there, and then I'll go ahead and turn over to that heading and activate the nav mode. That is about there, just a little bit left to go there. Looks like that's good and centered up now, so go ahead and hit nav. It enters into the Loc tracking mode. We're good there. And since we're centered on course, we're still on the 069 degree radial, 14.2 DME. We are established on that intermediate segment, so we'll go ahead and enter a vertical speed mode and go down at about 500 feet per minute to go down to this intermediate approach segment altitude. I'll pull the power back so that I stay at about 105 knots or so in the descent. Go ahead and center my heading bug up there. So we'll descend down to 3,200 feet, and then we'll look for 9 miles on our DME. We're now looking at the DME for the SDF, or MOR SDF. And when we get to 9 miles, we know we're about 3 miles away from the final approach fix, and we can go ahead and start to configure. All right, so I've leveled at 3,000 feet. I'm going to go ahead and get my next altitude in there, which will be 1,900 feet. My DDA is 1910, so that's below the DDA, but above the MDA. There is inside of 9 miles, so I'll go ahead and start configuring. I'll pull the power back to about 1,800 RPM or so. I'm already below 110, so I can drop that first notch of flaps. Wait for 85 and I'll drop the second notch of flaps. There's the second notch of flaps. Go and drop the third one at about 75 knots. I'll smoothly bring that power back in to about 2200 RPM or so. I want to maintain level at 70 knots. I'll go ahead and get my before landing checklist complete here. I've got my altitude set here. I'm going to go into the PFD here, and I'm going to turn off bearing pointer number 2 because it's providing information that I don't need at this point. Could zoom back in on our primary flight display. The needle is flipping here, so I'm going to go ahead and put it into a vertical speed mode and enter a 400 foot per minute descent, and then pull the power back to stay at 70 knots in the descent. So we're on the final approach segment, making our descent down to the runway, and we'll start cross-checking our altitudes as we make our descent. The first thing I'm looking for is 6.2 DME. I want to make sure that I'm about 2,900 feet. 2,917 is where I want to be. And if I'm not there, then I need to make some adjustments. So we've got 6.3 nautical miles, 6.2 nautical miles, there it is, and we're 2960, just a little bit high, but I'm okay with that. We'd probably also get handed off to the Common Traffic Advisory frequency at this time. They tell us to advise our cancellation in the air or on the ground, so we'll tell them we'll give you a call on the ground because we're still IMC. And then just remember to close out your flight plan so other people can get into this airport IFR. So we'll continue down at that 400 foot per minute descent. We're looking now for 5.2 DME. Should be about 2,600 feet when we get there, 2,604. There's 5.2. I was at 2,700 feet, so I'm just a little bit high, not more than about 100 feet high, and I'm okay with that right now. We'll double check it when we get to 4.2. Should be at about 2,300 feet at that point. I'll adjust my power here just a little bit to try to get right on 70 knots as I come down. Looking for 2,300-ish at 4.2. There's 4.3. 4.1, and I'm at 2,370 or so. Again, just about 100 feet high or so, and I'm okay with that. I'd rather be high than low. Next thing I'm looking for is 3.2, looking for 1978 or so. And the localizer tracking mode is doing a good job tracking this SDF. The only difference between an SDF and a localizer is that an SDF is not quite as sensitive and not quite as precise. Here comes 3.2 right there, and I'm at 2080, so it's still about 100 feet high. About 100 feet here, about 10 feet. I'll take a look up. There's 2,000. Take a look out, and there are our approach lights. So I'll kick the autopilot off. I can descend to 100 feet above the touchdown zone elevation with just the approach lights. And I also have the VASI in sight, which is unsurprisingly showing that I'm high, so I will try to make a correction and get back on that visual glide path. But that is an SDF approach. That's what they look like. They act almost exactly like a localizer approach. If you can fly a localizer approach, you can certainly fly an SDF approach. So to determine when you are proficient at this approach, it's basically the same standards as a localizer or any other non-precision approach for that matter. You can find those standards in the Airman Certification Standards for the Instrument Airplane Rating. It is Area of Operations 6, Instrument Approaches, Task A, Non-Precision Approach. Again, like the other approaches, you have criteria for prior to final approach and on the final approach segment. Prior to final approach, you should be able to maintain your altitude plus or minus 100 feet, maintain your heading plus or minus 10 degrees, maintain your airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, and accurately track radials, courses, and bearings. This means keeping it less than full-scale deflection for the VOR or the SDF course, except, of course, when you're passing directly over volunteer VOR and intercepting that radial outbound. On the final approach segment, once you get to the NDB and on the way down to your derived decision altitude. They want to see a stabilized approach, no excessive speed or excessive rate of descent, allowing no more than a 3/4 scale deflection of that SDF course guidance, maintaining your approach airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, immediately initiating the missed approach procedure at the derived decision altitude or any point prior to that you feel the approach is unsafe, and transitioning to a visual approach using a normal rate of descent and normal maneuvering once you have the required visual cues in sight. That concludes this video. Hopefully it's giving you the knowledge and skills you need to fly this approach in flight sim on your own. Again, if you've enjoyed the content, don't forget to like the video, share with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell to be alerted to new content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.